Good morning. It's Patrick Lovell coming to you on Monday, March 13th, 2023 at 10 a.m. my time. And this one's going to be a doozy. I feel like the film that swept the Academy Awards last night, as I sort of put my ducks in a row based on what I want to cover this morning. And the title of the film, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, personifies pretty much where my mind is pinballing at the moment, giving really, ironically, the Academy Awards and also really all of the news that has been coming at us fast and furious that underscores and undergirds and validates and makes even more clear what it is that I have been bringing to you in these truth bombs and our amazing 10-hour filibuster the American people, which is on our YouTube page at Patrick Lovell Truth Bombs the Con, called Deception Owns You. Our work and our unbelievably prescient series, The Con, at www.thecon.tv. And of course, our amazing podcast that we did with our friends from the Real Progressives at the New Untouchables, all of which those aspects are free. There's a slight cost if you decide to watch The Con, but if you don't want to spend money to watch The Con, you can get a lot of information by going to our website and going to the pull-down menu for videos, and you'll see about 30 microdocs there that shore up pretty much everything I'm telling you, but the real goods are in The Con. And I've got a lot more. I've got literally 300 hours more of information that blows up what we're all in the midst of in a way that literally, and I've observed between yesterday and today, I can't tell you how many imbeciles in mainstream media that literally can't tie their shoes together when it comes to understanding what it is our financial system is and does. And it's unfucking believable to me that high-paid, seemingly in touch personalities are there to, at the very best, give you maybe a murky understanding, acting as disinformation conduits, which is ironic, of course, of all things. Twitter files that were revealed and argued about in the Twitter hearings last week as it relates to intelligence institutions working with tech to suppress voices like mine that are actually giving you the inside detailed analysis of what is the crime racket that has complete control of the United States. So let's hit the rewind button quickly and just kind of set the table of what's happening as it relates to bank runs and the mechanics of Silicon Valley Bank, and as it relates to also Silvergate Bank and its receivership last week, and then kind of make a broader sort of case analysis of what everybody's missing and why these truth bombs in our effort to create a tidal wave populist movement with your engagement is the only way to rise above this madness of deception, mass deception, and really a shell game that has played the biggest sucker play in history on the American people, and quite frankly, people around the world. But with, of course, the complicity of all of the oligarchs out of the world, around the world that benefit from this system as well, which is what we're in the midst of, and potentially on the verge of a cataclysmic shift, which has been kind of in the works for some time. So let's just start at the beginning. And, I'm not an expert in tech finance, but what I can tell you is I understand what created the tech bubble and blowout in, the early 2000s. And I understand control fraud to a T. And I just learned this morning, for example, one of the senior executives at Silicon Valley Bank was the former CFO at Lehman Brothers. Go figure, okay? And so what's the connection there? Well, I don't have a detailed analysis of the connection there, nor do I have a detailed analysis of everything that took place that manifested the run, other than the talking points that we see all of the mainstream basically try to extrapolate, which is rising interest rates created a scenario where the Silicon Valley Bank had to issue, selling bonds to try to shore up, losses in other sectors, which indicated that they might be in for liquidity problems, which then led to, I think, a 60% run, where something along the lines of 48 billion, and don't hold me to that figure, was actually pulled, I think, in a day. Welcome to technology, right? But the issue at the moment is ultimately, which is the centerpiece of everything, is the extraordinary moves by our Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, and behind the scenes of the Federal Reserve and the President of the United States on a Sunday, being able to try to calm markets and say that the federal government is going to make sure that the banks are stable and that we're not going to have a financial meltdown based on some sort of run in the banking sector, which of course we've had, I don't know, let's do the math, going back to the 20s, lessons, following the Great Depression and the bank runs that led to Glass-Steagall, that led to the Securities and Exchange Commission and everything that those were supposed to do, that ultimately led to the FDC and depositor insurance. And then you fast forward to the late 90s when we got rid of most of those sorts of, foundational regulations to make sure we had a sound and safe banking system, of which, of course, our Secretary of Treasury said it's the most important to the global financial system to have a sound and safe banking system. Of course, the government was going to do everything in its power to make sure that there isn't contagion. And then they get to say things like, but we're not going to take it from the taxpayer, which is really incredible when you understand what MMT has been saying the whole time, and ultimately really how this whole thing works. So they guaranteed the depositors, and the depositors were a lot of VC and private equity funds that are way, way, way north of the FDIC insurance of $250,000. Of course, I just mentioned, I think $48 billion was, pulled out last Thursday. And a lot of these, companies and operations, and I know it was, one of them was actually trying to think of the online free television service, actually had its entire checking account there, $480 million or something like that. I can't remember the name of it. It's one of the secondary or tertiary ones, which I actually watch on occasion. But I'll come back to the name of that. It's not really that important compared to the point that I'm about to make. Is that the president and the Treasury Secretary and the entire financial system is addressing the concerns of what we all learned and most people are sort of kind of speculating about regarding what took place in the aftermath of the 2008 great financial crisis. And so when I'm telling you that everybody in mainstream media, whether it's CNN or whether it's CBS or the morning talk shows on Sunday morning and then things that happened last night, they literally have no idea about all of the stuff that I've been laying on you for a very long time. They don't understand anything about modern executive compensation and control fraud and Gresham's dynamic. They don't understand how the frickin', the sausage is made. They don't have time to ask those questions. Their job is to basically react in a opinion-oriented entertainment way without any sort of knowledge about anything. And they're there just to kind of react as the country reacts and, maybe give you access to some people that are actually playing us for fucking fools, i.e. the system. So going back to Janet Yellen, and it's not going to be a bailout, what it looks like is, from what I understand this morning, is that they did effectively what they did during the 2008 immediately after the great financial crisis, which was, you open the bank lending window, overnight bank lending window to those that are non-bank companies, and you get them to shift the sort of statutory limitations and regulations of what those companies are all about to be able to borrow quickly and rapidly to maintain its business operations. Now, in the case of Silicon Valley Bank, from what I understand, they just simply made $25 billion available in a sort of a special purpose vehicle to enable Silicon Valley Bank to be able to make its depositors whole, VCs and private equity, which are the worst vultures and pigs at the trough of this freaking free financialization that has been on overdrive since 2009. But during the COVID era, as it turns out, that the Silicon Valley Bank had grown by 200%. And what have I taught you about what happens when a bank grows exponentially? Well, that's the first indication of control fraud. Not to mention, did I say that the former chief financial operator for Lehman Brothers was a senior executive at SVP, whatever that means? It's pretty like, hey, have knowledge, will travel. So ultimately, in the case of who they were backstopping, look, the Federal Reserve kept interest rates down to zero, so it was like literally free money to those who had it or had access to it, particularly during the time of COVID, to try to stimulate the economy and to loan. But to loan to what? Now, in the general economy, whether it's the too big to fail banks, a lot of those loans may have gone to guaranteed car loans, which we now, I think many people are aware that there's a lot of people that got into car loans way over the head and started flipping and all sorts of manner of speculation, fraud, and this and that. And, just a version of what we might have called a subprime, but that's a misnomer, because what I've been also bringing to your attention from the very beginning is it wasn't subprime, it was liar's loans that blew up the world in 2008. But I'll get back to that. But going back to this so-called non-bailout that's not taxpayer-oriented, it just illustrates that the Federal Reserve can concoct under systemic emergency lending, which comes from none other than what I've been telling you for now a couple of years, Federal Reserve Act 13.3, which allows the Federal Reserve to provide lender of last resort liquidity in emergency scenarios. But what I've also been educating you about is that emergency scenarios should be for forest fires or some sort of war or something natural disaster oriented, not control fraud, which is fucking racketeering based on predation, based on deception, which is known in the vernacular and the trade, particularly as it relates to the Securities and Exchange Commission, deceptive acts and practices, which is illegal, which would get your freaking license yanked and everybody go to prison, theoretically, which hasn't happened ever in this modern era, okay? So, Sam Bankman-Fried. And that's because he was stealing from probably the worst actors that exist, not to mention his attorneys are the guys that are at the apex of all of this shit, which incidentally, I understand that Signature Bank just went into receivership and they're out of Manhattan and they handle law firms, white shoe law firms. They specialize in that, just like SVP specializes in tech. But when you understand, like, for example, what a lot of the mainstream, and I just happen to tune in, and it drives me absolutely nuts to see things like this. I watch Sagar and Genty and Sagar, if I pronounce his name correctly, and of course Crystal Ball, who I admire, and I appreciate Crystal Ball, and I've been on their program twice, once with Sagar and Crystal, and then once on the show with Kyle Kaliski, Crystal Ball's now husband, and her have a show called Kyle and Friends. And interestingly enough, Kyle, Crystal and Friends, and interestingly enough, and I'll pack this one away for later, but I want to touch upon this because I fell right between Russell Brand was before me, and then my partner and I, Eric Vaughn, and then David Sirota followed us right after. I'm going to try to remember why I made that point, but it's very important considering that I've been with Crystal and Sagar a couple of times, and I laid on them exactly what I'm telling you, but they still can't retain it. They don't understand it. And I was watching Crystal this morning going, I really can't wrap my head around it, but what she's following, and she's asking sincere questions, and she's on the right side of this, philosophically, ideologically, but she doesn't understand the details, which is the problem, and the facts are what matter. So, for example, they were following the sort of guidelines, if you will, that mainstream media and what the Fed's been saying, and it's all predicated on interest rate bumps quickly that have brought down the yields. that put the bank in a position that basic banking sort of operations put them in a scenario where their buffer was lower, and investors and depositors got spooked, so they decided to pull their money based on because they were worried about contagion. But why were they worried about contagion particularly, right? So some of the contagion that they might be aware of, because they were experts in Silicon Valley Bank, were some of the sort of sausage that the tech sector might be involved with. Now, I'm reminded of all of the things that took place in the COVID era that, involved like ETFs, and also, like the stuff that we saw the apes involved with GameStop and AMC theaters and that sort of thing, which in the end, a lot of these things are just gambling based on insider information and, pump and dump and all sorts of techniques to try to make quick money fast. And that's part of the problem, because it's all casino capitalism. But if you understand financialization and you understand what CEOs make their money on in tech, as opposed to private equity investors, as opposed to hedge fund investors, as opposed to actually bank executives, and how all of that stuff gets in the mix of the financialization, you got to understand how each one of those sort of sectors makes its money. So in the case of actually the bank executives, they make their money on making loans, right? And so how do you grow loans? How do you broaden the pot? Well, the real money isn't in mom and pop shops or in mom and pop mortgages. It's in massive mergers and acquisition deals on one side of the house, or, putting together huge, IPO offers and making fees on that, or also, just the trading of, what some of these in the tech sector might be up to in terms of some of these ETFs and everything else that might be underwritten by a bunch of shit that was actually the same type of shit that underwrote what became the great financial crisis in 2008, because nobody could keep up with it, and it's casino capitalism. And so at the end, what you have in a case of the Federal Reserve and the Treasury basically applying the standards of FDC insurance that goes to $250,000, but in this case, the tech financiers in the billions of dollars, they might be backstopping because we haven't gone in and taken a look at what exactly these companies are in the midst of in creating their sausage. It could be a control fraud where the underwriting standards and everything that they're doing is basically sawdust. We don't know that. It happens all the time, and it's been our economy since 2009 at least, okay? And it's kind of part and parcel to the whole globalization, neoliberalism sort of 5 decades march, where we farmed out the golden goose, where we are not producing in the United States everything that we consume. We're a credit society. And the middlemen are the ones that have been making all the money for the whole time, but based on fraud. What is fraud? Is it shenanigans? No, it's deceptive acts and practices. It's theft by deception, which is criminal, which in many cases, in most cases, I think in all cases, are felonies. So in the tune of the 2008 great financial crisis, the underwriting standards were insane based on liars' loans, deceptive acts and practices, guys that were breaking civil rights laws by saying that they were providing specific, detailed aspects of what that particular loan product was, and they lied about it because the people that were actually borrowing didn't have an attorney there and couldn't interpret or read or understand, because it would take them probably years to understand all of the different mechanics and flip-flops and stuff that were baked into those contracts that ultimately they were, in the vintage of 2004 to 2006, set up to fail, which we called shorts, okay? Which is just, again, these are felonies, but it wasn't just felonies. So I'll give you an example of another failure in media. So, for example, and I love the movie, and I love the talent that put it all together, and I'm not criticizing them per se, because it's a big conversation, it's a big topic, you have to have a lot of knowledge, and you have to have a lot of resources to be able to get there, which not everybody has, because everybody tries to move so fast and furious. And so what happened with Plan B in the film that many people saw because it was extremely successful, that is categorized as a comedy, which was based on the book by Michael Lewis, who knows his shit, let me tell you, but he focuses on characters and stories to make things amplified that, people are going to buy and watch and be entertained by. So The Big Short lays out a good portion of some of the Machiavellian scenarios that I'm explaining to you, but it ultimately got it wrong. Okay, it got a lot right. It got some more right than others. It was very entertaining. It definitely brought out the right questions, And it was, the screenwriter is Adam McKay, who I absolutely love. So no criticism there. Again, I understand what they were doing, but at the same time, they didn't fully understand the subject. So there were scenes, between Margot Robbie in a hot tub trying to explain the details of derivatives, to keep our attention, while this personal drama of people that are kind of flawed, but at the same time good people that were, personifying what was Michael Burry in The Big Short, and that was a genius scenario. He saw that nothing was aligning, and so therefore he shorted the market. He knew it was going to explode, so that was great because he did his due diligence. He understood what he's doing. He's a genius. He could, read the tea leaves, and he walked out with, I think Michael Burry walked out with a $498 million. Now, in Plan B's, which is Brad Pitt's company, and Adam McKay did the screenwriting, and it was, ultimately blamed on strip dancers. You might recall the scene where there were strip dancers talking to a broker, and it was actually the guys from Michael Burry's office doing the investigations after the information they got from Deutsche Bank, where they knew it was a house of cards, and so they were doing their due diligence, and they're talking to a strip dancer who's got like 5 or 6 properties. I can't remember what they were, so don't hold me to the specifics on that. But the bottom line is, the point was that it was like, here were all of these nutbags in the United States that really didn't have, any realm of being anywhere near a financialization business investment and managing it the way they did. It was all make-believe, and they were making fun of it in the movie of like, look at these dipshits that were getting these loans. No, they didn't understand that it was the fuckers that were making the loans to the dipshits available because they were raking in giant fees and incentivized through high yield spread premium to basically sell the worst product available using deceptive acts and practices. And in addition to that, they were creating value for the homes through appraisal fraud, where the lenders would have to actually put the full court press on the lenders to basically lie about the value of the homes, which actually got a lot of the predation in the African American communities, which I'll circle back to, which we feature prominently in our series, which is that our entry point, which was based on Addie Polk, an African American widow who ended up being evicted from her home that she had lived in for 40 years illegally because the cops didn't realize that they were, foreclosing illegally based on documentation fraud. And this poor African-American widow ended up shooting herself in the chest 5 times as a result of being thrown in the streets. I mean, can you think of anything more horrific than that? But that's how this whole thing went down, and there's so much more information. But going back to The Big Short and Plan B and everything else, the last 5 minutes of The Big Short, they actually asked the prescient questions. They said, okay, so what ultimately happened is that the Department of Justice showed up, they got to the bottom of it, they flipped the script, they arrested all the bad guys, and then we ended up reconfiguring our economy because that's what America does. And then something like not. Well, that's exactly right. It didn't happen that way. What happened was we ended up backdooring in 2009 $29 trillion illegally using Federal Reserve Act 13.3 to shore up the financial system, because the bank CEOs that set up everybody based on Gresham's dynamic, control fraud, and modern executive compensation, because that's what they were incentivized to do. They basically held a gun to their heads and they said to the authorities, stop or I'll shoot. Meaning that you take me out, I'm going to take out everything, which is systemically important institutions, too big to fail banks, and contagion. But they did it based on a fraud recipe, which is basically when you are a CEO, you make your, in the financial system, you make your bonuses by increasing the amount of lending that you do. So you have to open up the box to more people that you can lend to. So you get rid of your underwriting standards. And what that's going to do, and you do that based on having less and less equity, which is buffers to be able to sustain a downturn. And then ultimately, you create the frequency of the loans. You have less of a buffer. You're going to be made incredibly rich. So is the board, but ultimately the entire situation is going to collapse because it's unsustainable. And so when it collapsed, that goes back to this thing that I learned on Wall Street, as early as, I want to call it 2011, the idea, the notion of I'll be gone, you'll be gone. They don't give a fuck. They're just playing in the moment. They're playing in that moment to get as much bang as you can for your buck in that moment and trade. And if the shit blows up based on underwriting and based on the stability of the system, it's going to be somebody else's problem. And by the way, these brokers are always playing with other people's money, which is another part of this whole thing, which goes back to what took place in the late 90s when we got rid of all of the regulations that we learned from the Great Depression. But during the Clinton administration, we deregulated. We created deregulation, desupervision, and decriminalization that led to basically outlaw criminality by what we think are institutions that we can trust. And they were not only just doing that to people that were borrowing or refinancing to stay in their homes, but to speculators and people that were out of their minds in terms of just taking extreme risk. And then ultimately they tied that whole thing to pensions. People have been working their entire lives as school teachers or hospital administrators or nurses or any manner of working type people. They stole their pensions. In fact, all the money managers call these types of scenarios dumb money, especially if they're state pensions or federal pensions. They just basically steal based on this smoke and mirrors bullshit, based on insider information and all of the stuff that you've heard before with hedge funds. And private equity is even worse. Private equity sets everybody up, which is what they're doing in Silicon Valley, particularly Silicon Valley Bank, which you create mergers and acquisitions based on loan products where you kill the golden goose, you bankrupt the company, you buy it back for pieces, you pay yourself the whole time, and then you try to increase the stock by destroying everybody else. These are all vulture late stage capitalism, which is criminality. But it also then it works its way into government and regulation through cronyism and revolving door and all of the things that we've enabled that followed the 2008 great financial crisis. We also created the Dodd-Frank rules and regulations that were supposed to create buffers so these types of runs wouldn't happen. So all of the situations that are taking place at Silicon Valley Bank can be summarized in, hey, second first, same as the first. It's the same thing in terms of the federal government creating bank holding companies to lend emergency funds to protect the assets of the guys that blew this thing up on control fraud. Now, I don't know the details of exactly what the executives at Silicon Valley Bank were involved with, what the private equity and the hedge, private equity and the tech guys were doing, because that's not where my complete focus has been. But I can tell you in a lot of cases, Sam Bankman-Fried had gone, for example, in the crypto space with FTX and then ultimately into this bullshit Alameda. He'd gone to some of the biggest hedge funds, or I should say private equity funds in Silicon Valley, and they were throwing billions to him without doing their due diligence. I mean, it was like, because they're all making fees. This whole thing is casino capitalism, and it all relies on the Federal Reserve keeping interest rates down as one part of the equation, but the other part of it is quantitative easing. So what we did in the aftermath of 2008, if everything I've told you isn't already enough to blow your mind, what we ended up doing was Timothy Geithner, the former president of the New York Fed, who was, his job was to make sure none of this stuff happened, because the New York Fed is the most powerful Fed that exists in the entire system. And their job was to regulate everything that I told you didn't happen. And of course, he didn't regulate it. And so what happened? Did he get fired? Did he get, embarrassed and shamed and have all of his money taken? No, President Obama made him the Secretary of the Treasury, of which he and John Paulson and Ben Bernanke sold the world on TARP, which is the Troubled Assets Relief Program. But then they backdoored this Quantitative Easing Federal Reserve Act 13.3 to shore up all of these financial institutions that had gotten bankrupted by their own fucking criminality. And then we gave them trillions upon trillions of dollars. And if that wasn't enough, we created quantitative easing. And Ben Bernanke had said famously that, the American people are foam on the runway for the crashing financial system, which was people like me and millions of others. What they did was they just basically made it possible to buy the so-called toxic asset that the goddamn banks in this system created so that they could get it off their books so they could loan again. But what did they start doing, and meaning the banks, the too big to fail banks, back in 2016? Well, they got involved with stock buybacks and zombie companies and all sorts of other stuff. That's this financial engineering and financialization that doesn't impact the real economy. And then boom, we had COVID. But interestingly enough, before COVID, we had a massive run that required emergency stimulus by the Federal Reserve in 2019, which was dealt with the repo run that I think emanated from SoftBank in Japan. And I don't know, and nobody knows the details of exactly why that happened, but we do know that the Federal Reserve created emergency lending scenarios through Federal Reserve Act 13.3, which I've seen figures as high as $22 trillion. So if you add it up, that's, $30 trillion roughly, and I think it's even more than 30 trillion in 2009, 22 trillion in 2019, and that's before COVID. And so then what happened during COVID is a very similar scenario, the dynamics that are happening now, but instead, the Federal Reserve, not instead, but in addition, the Federal Reserve ended up, again, continuing quantitative easing and buying, portfolios of mortgage-backed securities. Mortgage-backed securities in this vintage in 2020 that rich people, for example, in my neck of the woods, I'll tell you a quick story here, as if any of this stuff is quick. So in 2008, I was making great money working on a television show, basically giving houses away, ironically, to people around the country. And then that show went out of business out of the blue because it was connected to everything I'm talking about. Eventually, it blows me up. I go through the financial crisis of 2008, Lehman Brothers. It's a crazy story. I've told it a million times. But ultimately, it destroys my life. I end up going through this foreclosure process. I personally didn't ask any questions about the foreclosure process back in the day because ultimately I was like, I can't pay this, and I'm going to go, I'm done. There's nothing I can do about it. I can't fight these guys. I don't have any money for an attorney. I don't even know what the situation is at that time. All I knew was that it didn't add up, and that sent me on my journey because I was able, as a producer, to go find someone to invest in this investigation that I knew that the federal government didn't do. And lo and behold, many, many years later, we got all of the answers that the entire federal government has hidden from you, as well as media. And so ultimately, you fast forward then to 2020, and I get the second action here. We release our show, The Con. I think it's going to blow up. I think we're going to get a deal on HBO or Netflix. And ultimately, what happened was it didn't go there. And I kept thinking to myself, well, wait a second, I wonder if we're getting jammed up by something. Well, lo and behold, I come to learn that BlackRock is basically a huge investor in all of the major platforms that we were trying to get on. And I had been exposing for some time that it was BlackRock that was actually became the manager of these emergency stimulus operations by the Federal Reserve, known as Maiden Lane initially, that then morphed into what I was telling you about Federal Reserve Act 13.3 and quantitative easing, which put them in the pole position to become the most important company in the history of the world, because they were representing the federal government of the United States, but they got to make the decisions, which ultimately over the last 13 years, I mean, it's like this quasi private-public relationship. But who voted for Larry Fink to rule the world? No, and he is a recipient and a beneficiary of all of the stuff that I'm trying to tell you. So in 2020, for example, when this next round happened during COVID, I'm expecting us to go to the moon, that millions of people are going to find out about our story, that we're going to get on to the next production, because I've got so much more information that I need to reveal, but it never went anywhere. So we ended up doing self-distribution. Fortunately, we're able to, have the resources to get ourselves on Apple TV and Amazon Prime and stuff like that. But ultimately, I can tell you, as most of us now understand through the Twitter files, that if you are, for some reason, a threat to the system, that they can suppress you. They can shadow ban you. They can prevent any manner, shape, or form, and you'd probably have to spend a shit ton of money to be able to get the right information out there, to get it to the right people. And meanwhile, the market is completely up to its eyeballs with its own problems, and it can't focus on anything. But meanwhile, it keeps getting bitch slapped by the system, which this past weekend is exactly the same thing has been happening the entire time. Now, ultimately, in my particular case, because of the Federal Reserve's emergency stimulus and this like nuclear purchase of mortgage-backed securities in 2000, ended up allowing the rich to buy all sorts of real estate, and many of them to move out of the big city centers like New York and San Francisco to land in places where I live, like in Park City, Utah, where basically they were shelling out top dollar because it was free money to them. And as it turns out, the lenders that were giving them free money to buy property shot these prices to the roof. And then, of course, the lenders that were providing that securitized these in the mortgage-backed securities that the Federal Reserve was purchasing under quantitative easing. So it was just shelling out gazillions of money to the fucking ultra rich, and they don't provide it to the real economy. They do it with these financializations, which a lot of the time is just control fraud. So it totally kinks the market. And that's what happened all the way through COVID. So it got me twice, right? I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to be victorious over this whole thing. But it destroyed my life in 2008. I finally found redemption by getting the truth, by telling the $29 trillion truth. But it lands on deaf ears. And then ultimately they get me again. and I've been trying to scream for the last 2 years from the mountaintops, this is how the whole thing works, and now it's happening again, right in front of our face, which is the exact same situation. So what happens time and time and time again is that media doesn't get it. Nobody's talking about the criminality within the situation. They're giving you talking points that the Fed's actually doing this, and why? Because in the end of the day, ultimately when the Fed purchases all of these securities and these mortgage-backed securities to prop up the primary dealer brokers in the financial system, they're financing the government by selling these bonds all over the world, and everybody, countries and everything else invest in, all of the stuff that we're selling, and, they're selling toxic assets, okay? But all of the oligarchs are buying it because there's no other safe place around the world to park their capital. And there might be a rip because of the Ukraine situation and Saudi and China and all of those things, which could actually really undermine the entire thing, because if the hegemony of the United States dollar as the world's global reserve currency goes by the wayside and the yuan, replaces this, and there's like some sort of brick country coalition, do you think that there might be a global world war as a result of that? Yeah, I would think so. But, look, I digress. The bottom line is nobody understands how the system works. And this is why I'm asking you to invest in me, and for everybody who is not part of the investor class, who has an automatic backstop to lie, steal, and cheat the American people with the full faith and credit of the United States. If you're somewhere from this position down, which by my count is 99% of the population, then you're going to want to understand what it is that I'm telling you. And if you can find $13 to donate to this massive effort to be able to create a populist tidal wave movement to purge corruption, the idea eventually is they can't ignore us. If maybe 13 million people wind up donating $13 million, that gives me the opportunity to put together a multimedia presentation, not that unlike Live Aid, but to take it around the country as a sort of revival tour to show you all of these things that I'm talking about. And also feature people much smarter than myself who have taught me this whole thing. The idea is that I'll show the multimedia, I'll be able to show, what the American government and the integrity of law has been designed, and how it's designed, and how the policy gets there, and ultimately how it was betrayed, who it was betrayed by, and what it led to, and then ultimately why you're in the situation you're in. If we can get millions upon millions of people on the same page, then this lying and this deception of the people in media who don't know what the fuck's going on, and they're just getting a paycheck and they're too stupid to ask questions anyway, or even quite frankly, people online who are asking questions, but they don't have the due diligence or the resources to go get all of the information that I've said, and so they're just following and all of the other people, and they're chasing their tail, and a bunch of misinformation gets out there. Meanwhile, we've got the FBI and the intelligence agencies suppressing people like me and letting people like Tucker Carlson lie to you about the insurrection to your fucking face. And that's just one part of it, okay? Media has failed. The United States is a failed state. The whole scenario with East Palestine, Ohio, and the trail derailment, and then the after sort of revelations of Norfolk Southern's executives not cleaning up the spill, but they've made X amount of money and they're basically suborning and suppressing the unions and all of that kind of stuff. What other evidence do you need? We live in a corporate fascist state undergirded by a criminal syndicate that uses socialism of the full faith and credit of the United States to backstop the system, which is called tyranny. Do you not get that? This is how tyranny has functioned from the beginning of civilization. The Roman Empire, the aristocracies, the Holy Roman Empire, the Catholic Church and all. In the end, all of the stuff that I'm talking about with power, a lot of the times ends up coming down to corruption at the same time. Our founders of the United States determined that they had enough of it. They rebelled. They fought King George III. When you fight King George III at that time period, you're fighting also the Redcoats, the mercenaries, and then you're also fighting the East India Trading Company, which is the composite of how our military and our financial system operates. And again, with our judiciary, and that's the last piece that I need to fill in here, literally millions upon millions of people that got stuck in this situation wound up going through the courts. 99% of the people didn't fight like myself. I had to go do it a different way. I had to actually put it all together because I'm a producer. I think this way. I studied political science. I see big picture analysis, and I have to understand. I have an insatiable curiosity to have answers to questions that don't make sense. That's who I am. But ultimately, there were many millions of people, and I'm aware of tens of thousands of people, and maybe it's gotten lower, but it's a very small percentage of the whole. Because, by the way, we had 10 million at least filed or foreclosures in 2009 but I think by 2012, that's what we attribute the global financial total of houses that were foreclosed upon. But I know that we had 16 million filed foreclosures by 2012. Nobody has an accurate number of actually how many actual foreclosures we actually had. We just know that tens of millions of people were impacted by this. Tens of millions of people got shoveled into the fucking, the landfill, bulldozed into the landfill. And this is the ultimate, and I'm sorry, the ultimate eureka. All of the liar's loans documents that were put into the millions of freaking securities that we sold around the world based on the deceptive acts and practices, which are tens of millions of felonies, they all wound up using the same process in the courts, using liars' documentations to create what we call fraud closures. There are these elements within the courts that are called servicers and foreclosure mills that have been incentivized by the quantitative easing to buy the toxic assets off the bank, which is what Timothy Geithner said, that the American people are foam on the runway for the crashing financial system, which just, takes what I'm telling you to the ultimate level. Believe me, all of this stuff is real. This is the world that you live in 2023. Now, there are people in our society like brain surgeons that, just have their money in real estate and their stocks, and, they're focused on being brain surgeons. And so we can't, accost or blame or conflate wealthy, successful people like that, who are the meritocracy, who just happen to be bought into the system. They're not the ones who created this problem. So please do not blame the 1% necessarily. You got to focus on who the real problem is. It is, quite frankly, the titans of finance and the titans of tech, and they own the revolving door of government, and they own the courts. Judges who have salaries to last the entire career have literally looked at defense attorneys, and I've seen it, and say, if you were our U.S. government telling me all of this stuff was true, then I would allow this, but since you're not, I'm not going to allow discovery. Which means they're not looking at the evidence, which means that, like the Alec Murdaugh trial that just happened, that just got a lot of people shocked because he murdered his wife and his son, imagine the judge and the jury not accepting or looking or investigating the evidence and then trying to rule accordingly. It's a railroad job. It's a monumental railroad job. If I can get you to contribute $13 and you go to 13 other people to let them know that there is a movement afoot that will create this tidal wave resurrection through this, factual representation, the light of truth, to overwhelm the madness and oceans of lies, that all you have to do is look at Fox. Rupert Murdoch on down, every single one of them were like, yeah, we lie because it's our business model. Onwards and upwards.